Okay, hello everyone. It's great to be back speaking for Southwest writers again. I've talked to you a number of times. My background is in writing and theater. I'm a novelist and playwright. I also write nonfiction. My fourth novel, The Unmasking, came out last fall. I'll just show you the cover. And I'm also the co-publisher of Bosque Press. Some of you may be familiar with a couple of the magazines we have published. One was Bosque, which was a literary journal that we published from 2011 to 2019. And now we are continuing to publish something called ABQ Imprint. I'll show you our new issue. And ABQ Imprint is half art and half writing. And it's mostly New Mexico authors, a lot of local authors. So I urge you to check it out. We have a launch for issue number 5 at Bookworks on December 5th, which is a Sunday at 3:30. And a lot of the readers are local, but some of them are connected to us, but from elsewhere in the country. So I'm going to talk today from a book that I'm writing about the audience and your writing. I'm calling the working title of the book right now is Your Story and Your Audience. And perhaps it's because of my performance background and my theater background, but I've always thought that audience is sort of underappreciated among writers. I mean, they think about it and they want one, but how do we really think about our audience and how can that help our writing? So I'll start off, this is going to kind of be a chapter in the new book, but it's really kind of an overview of the book as well. The summary of what I'm going to say today is that every successful narrative is a dance between the author's intentions and the reader's expectations of how the story will develop and deliver. We'll explore today building a relationship with your audience, one that fuels the reader's satisfaction and investment in your story. I'll address audience issues in both memoir and fiction as we go along. And poets, this applies to you as well, of course. But today, in the interest of time, I've selected examples from fiction and memoir. Thinking about your audience, about an active reader reading your fiction or memoir, is a way to allow you to see the significance of your story. When we imagine how our story will be received by someone else, how it will impact someone else, it helps us make key decisions in the process of writing and keeps in front of us, like the ultimate carrot, that this story will matter to other people as well. A story is a transaction between a writer and a reader through a text, or in an oral context, a performance. We'll be looking today at what I call the contract with the reader. Many writers write for a select audience, maybe a group of people they think will really relate to what they're writing. For example, a memoir about breast cancer may be written with cancer survivors in mind, detailing the challenges of contending with the disease and emerging battered but much wiser, hopefully, and still going forward. Other writers tell a specific story, the death of a spouse, the difficulties of relationships with family or a sibling, the victorious climb out of poverty into a life of education and purpose, as in Tara Westover's book. And assume that the story's compelling properties will attract the readers it ought to have. In fiction, the boundaries of genre, like literary fiction, mystery, historical fiction, speculative fiction, there's many genres as we know, put broad parameters around plot, but within each form, great latitude exists. In novels and stories, the opening pages set up what I call an invitation to the reader to immerse himself or herself into a world with specific characters involved in a situation that challenge the reader to dive in and experience a compelling voice and style. The expectations that the writer sets up in the beginning of tone and style, of subject matter, and of the catalyst for the story itself lead the reader to desire a satisfying resolution and completion of those expectations by the story's end. And by the way, at the end of my remarks, I would welcome any comments or questions as I'm developing these ideas. In whatever ways the writer considers the concept of audience, audience is essential, the direct perceiver of the experience the work details. Your audience receives your story, interprets it, digests it. Through the interaction of writer, story, reader, your story becomes part of that person's experience. A greater awareness of audience makes the decisions of you, the writer, easier. If, for example, we think about each chapter as a microcosm of the book with its own story arc, crisis followed by rising action, followed by a climactic moment, then structuring the book becomes more manageable. Instead of 250 or 300 pages stretching out into the distance, we can think of 10 or 15 or 20 chapters of episodes or scenes that unspool our story in a way that sweeps the reader along. And I think this is very important, to not terrify yourself with, oh my God, this has to be 500 pages or it has to be 200 pages, but to break things up into segments. Sometimes when we read, we imagine the writer whispering in our ear. The experience is that intimate. As the author Rebecca Solnit writes, a book is a heart that only beats in the chest of another. The ability to create intimacy and community at the same time helps explain the popularity and the significance of memoirs like Joan Didion's The Year of Magical Thinking and Tara Westover's Educated. If this level of engagement occurs, the writer has found a way to capture his or her audience and not let them go until the story is through with them. The early 20th century writer Gertrude Stein once said, "I write for myself and for strangers." It's absolutely true that first and foremost, we do write for ourselves. We are the watchers and the listeners of all of our stories. We hear and sometimes see the story first in our own heads. And yet, we all yearn for our stories to go beyond us, to reach others, to affect the lives of those strangers Stein is talking about. Today, I'd like to first explore a bit what our obligations are to our audience. How do we approach the idea of the reader out there in the world? How can we court the reader, reach the reader, and be inspired by our readers? The importance of an audience is something I think we all know innately. Writers, after all, are people who like to share. We communicate our stories to those who wish to listen. We want to connect with others, to entertain them, to educate them, and sometimes to persuade them. We want to make an impact. Those who want to write for themselves are doing something important and valuable. But today I want to speak to those who wish to reach outside themselves and share their writing with readers, who want to fill the empty page with living, breathing characters and a gripping situation. The page and the stage share this need for an audience, a reader or listener, to complete the loop that exists among author, text, and appreciator. Imagine an audience in a theater where they cannot see or hear. The play is not reaching beyond the footlights. Actors talk about needing the feedback of the audience, that it makes the moment on stage real, something visceral and exciting. There's a reason that the first storytelling was oral. Traditions were passed on this way, with a living body speaking to another living body. The audience not only interprets the story, but it shapes the story. with its perceptions and its own experiences. Leslie Marmon Silko once said, and I paraphrase, that the best storytellers create an atmosphere where the listeners feel that they are part of the story. And I think we feel that a lot with family stories. And we love hearing family stories because we feel we are a part. Sometimes we're referred to, but generationally we are referred to. But today we're talking about written stories. How can they have the same kind of immediacy as oral ones? Let's start with what our obligations are as writers to our audience in writing memoir. And that will lead us to the expectations of your audience, and finally ways to honor the reader and honor your story. First, our readers expect that the story in a memoir will be about a very specific and a subjective vision of the writer. It's the story of a particular journey that the writer has taken. No one else could possibly tell this story. It may be challenging, risky, funny, embarrassing, thrilling, enchanting, or many other things, but it is subjective. Your first obligation is to make the memoir about you. This sounds obvious, but I cannot tell you how many times a writer has come up to me when the person is writing a memoir about their family, and she knows all kinds of things about various people and their histories, but I often have to say, where are you in this story? You, the author, are the one who filters the story. You're the anchor who perceives the importance of events. You are the one who changes in the course of the memoir. You are the one who has to develop the voice of the story. All the interesting events in the world don't make a memoir until we have the glue of the story, the impact of the events on the protagonist. In a memoir, that is you, the writer who translates his or her vision into that of the speaker in the memoir. Your experience, filtered and crafted, of course, must be at the center of your memoir. In fiction, we expect subjectivity. We're not interested particularly in truth in the same way. We suspend disbelief happily as writers and as readers. Once upon a time, there was this place, these people, and this story. First, there is the idiosyncratic voice of the narrator, which sets a tone for the story and leads us into its depths. Point of view helps us as well. A first-person narrator is not always reliable, for example. And I'd like to use this example from a story many of you may have read at some point. We know in Eudora Welty's Why I Live at the P.O. that our narrator puts herself first. She says, I was getting along fine with Mama, Papa, Daddy, and Uncle Rondo until my sister Stella Stellarando just separated from her husband and came back home again. Mr. Whitaker. Of course, I went with Mr. Whitaker first when he first appeared here in China Grove, taking pose yourself photos, and Stellarando broke us up. Told him I was one-sided, bigger on one side than the other, which is a deliberate, calculated falsehood. I'm the same. Stellarando is exactly 12 months to the day younger than I am, and for that reason, she's spoiled. This voice is a comic one, a sassy one, and a Southern one. Mama, Papa, Daddy, Uncle Rondo, and Stellarando call up characters from the pre-World War II South. She's also defensive. Stellarando broke up her relationship with Mr. Whitaker. She gets everything and takes everything away from her sister, our narrator. Then she throws it away. We know we're going to hear her version of events by the way she begins. Told him I was one-sided, bigger on one side than the other, which is a calculated, deliberate falsehood. We find, for those of you who know this story, that she has renounced her family and has gone to live in the PO where she is postmistress. This voice invites us into a colorful world full of exaggeration and full of her desire for us to hear the real truth, which is her truth, no one else's. But we know that from the very beginning. Our second obligation is that the story will be of consequence. Since we cannot control what has consequence for the reader, we can only have control over what is consequential for us, the writer. And as you all know, if you have passion about your story, if it tells a journey that is important to you, it will have that weight for the reader as well. We read stories to see how others have faced the challenges of life. Here are a couple of examples of openings in memoir that show us that the story underway is intensely tied in with the life of the writer. At the end of the prologue of Richard Russo's memoir, Elsewhere, introducing his life with his mother, his father did not raise him, he writes, "What follows in this memoir is a story of intersections, of place and time, of private and public, of linked destinies and flawed devotion. It's more my mother's story than mine, but it's mine too, because until just a few years ago, she was seldom absent from my life. It's about her character, but also about where she grew up, fled from and returned to again and again, about contradictions she couldn't resolve, and so passed on to me, knowing full well I'd worry them, much like a dog worries a bone, gnawing, burying, unearthing, gnawing again, until there's nothing left but sharp splinters and bleeding gums. My mother was forever misjudging, not just distance and direction, but the sturdiness of the barriers erected between her and what she so desperately desired. I should know. I was one of them." Russo and his mother lived intertwined lives when he was a child, and so what his mother was and became is inseparable from his own history. To write her history is to uncover his own. And of course, that's another reason we write, is to uncover our own lives. Even though he says his book is more his mother's story, it really isn't, as he returns again and again to how this particular mother made him the writer and the person he is today. She, and his reactions to her, shaped him as a person and as the writer he became. A very different emphasis is found in Annie Dillard's iconic memoir, An American Childhood. She takes us on a journey into her past that is anchored by geography and place. She begins her prologue. "When everything else has gone from my brain, the president's name, the state capitals, the neighborhoods where I lived, and then my own name, and what it was on earth I sought, and then at length the faces of my friends, and finally the faces of my family. When all this has dissolved, what will be left, I believe, is topology, the dreaming memory of land as it lay this way and that." Dillard's childhood is etched in the topography of where she grew up. Her dreaming memory is anchored by land. Her search for self involves her body in space, which in turn encapsulates her imagination. Often a memoir centers on the crucial development of the writer or the struggles of growing up, which is why childhood is so often the subject of memoir. The recent novel, The Guest Book by Sarah Blake, tells the story of an American family from the 1930s to the present over 3 generations. Its consequence comes from the convergence during most of the story of 3 strands of social change, as well as incredibly great characters. The strands are the rise of Black demands for equality, the post-war ascendance of Jewish professionals, and the decline of WASP-dominant influence, political, cultural, and financial spheres. Is just as profoundly at this time as it did after World War I. The historical impact of collisions after World War II made the book one insightful for our present. As we are experiencing today, not everyone embraces change, equality, or inclusion. It's really a terrific book if you haven't seen it, so I really recommend it. A third obligation is that your novel or memoir adopts a structure that serves the story being told, one that the reader can. Let me see if I can remember where we are before we broke up. I think I was talking about The Guest Book by Sarah Blake. Does that sound familiar?
Right. Yes.
And did I get through the cultural changes that she is tracing in the book?
Yes. Yeah, we started Black Jews. You just started it.
I just started that. Okay. Well, she's really talking about the civil rights movement and the breakdown of WASP culture. And she's doing it by exploring this WASP family that interacts in a very social and political way. So as we experience in this book, as we're experiencing now, not everyone is embracing change, equality, or inclusion. A third obligation is that your novel or memoir adopts a structure that serves the story by being told, so that the reader can trust that it will lead her to greater insight or understanding. This structure is determined with the turning point, a moment when one part of life ends and another begins. The writer is not the same after this series of events that he or she writes about, if they're writing a memoir, for instance. Abigail Thomas does this in A Three Dog Life. Monday, April 24th at 9:40 at night, our doorman Pedro called me on the intercom. "Your dog is in the elevator," he said. The world had just changed forever, and I think I knew it even then. "My dog? Where is my husband?" I asked. This harrowing passage spotlights the moment when Abigail and her husband Rich's life together changes irrevocably. Rather than proceed chronologically, Thomas will instead follow two narrative threads: what happens after this moment and her life with Rich before it. Writers observe this turning point or catalyst and tell their stories in many ways: chronologically, associatively, or in this book, a collage fashion, pasting up short chapters against others. You can also use a circular style. I cover structure in detail in chapter 3 of my book, Find Your Story, Write Your Memoir. A novel recently on the bestseller list, The Midnight Library, and perhaps some of you have read that, tells the story of a woman who attempts to end her life, but she finds herself in a kind of bardo in the midnight library, poised between life and death. She can choose to go back into one of the life choices she regrets not taking, very intriguing, to see if she can find meaning and safety there. In this speculative story, the movement between the new lives she chooses and her return to the library when she once again is not satisfied provides the momentum for the plot and undergirds the story and characters. Its associative structure is layered with repetitions, with characters recurring with varying personalities in the different lives she undertakes. A fourth obligation to the reader is that the ending or the resolution will be earned. And this may be one of the most important things for any of us writers. This means that your novel or memoir has created a series of building blocks with scene and texture and attention to details of character and landscape that lead to your carefully crafted ending. That ending may not tie up all of the challenges or difficulties in your memoir, or to all the threads and subplots in your novel. But it's an arrival, a stage that you and your reader have arrived at together. You prepare the reader for your plot and progression by using what I call scaffolding. You layer events, scenes, details that underscore your main themes as the story unfolds. Think of it as constructing a building, with each floor contributing to the one above and the one below. Such details reinforce your story. This sense of having earned an ending makes the difference between the reader recommending your book to others or closing the book in disappointment, or worse, throwing the book across the room. Now, we want to avoid that at all costs, I think. For example, in a mystery novel where the search for the murderer is the crucial question, to deny the reader a satisfying answer to that question leads to disappointment. Now, of course, you may be experimenting and trying to deliberately frustrate the reader. That's another story that we could get into on another day. During what was called the golden age of British mystery writing, writers like Agatha Christie had Poirot convening the suspects together to explain the methods of the murder, a convention that readers at that time expected. We see this in Murder on the Orient Express, including in the recent movie remake of the novel with Kenneth Branagh. In my recent novel, The Unmasking, which is in part an homage to the locked room mystery that Christie used to such great effect, had I not made a locked room an essential part of the plot and resolution, that omission would have disrupted the satisfaction of the earned ending. The earned ending connects with beginnings which are paramount in establishing the contract with the reader. The critic Kenneth Burke once said that form is fulfilling the expectations that you create in your reader. And that is just so important. I mean, we create the expectations, so we have to fulfill them. Your opening sets up those expectations through its voice, its tone, its story world, and its occasion of the telling. For example, is the way you've executed the structure in your story consistent? To extend that example, if you choose to write the remembering narrator in a memoir in past tense, and you're experiencing narrator in the present, have you made this distinction clear and consistent? If not, what effect are you trying to achieve? And importantly, does the catalyst that begins the memoir or novel in the prologue or first chapter, that occasion of the story moment, get developed and executed in ways that satisfy the expectations you've created at the beginning? Even if you write a memoir in the vein of Abigail Thomas's Safekeeping, which uses a collage structure, there is an organic logic to your story. And I think in writing, once we find that organic logic, whatever it is, for us, it's organic to us and our story, the worst part of the writing is over. Omissions or gaps between the episodes all add to this organic piece you've created. Think in terms of a quilt or a painting. Collections of linked short stories like Olive Kittredge by Elizabeth Strout operate like collage as well, which invites the reader to fill in the gaps and make connections between the stories. Your book is a puzzle that the ending brings into view as a whole. You don't leave out the key pieces you've led the reader to expect. And now I want to conclude with the ways we honor our reader. An awareness of your reader as you write raises the bar as you work. We've mentioned beginnings, structure, and endings. Honoring the reader means making the pleasure of reading your memoir even more satisfying, or your novel, by considering the balance and proportion of events. If something is absolutely key to the narrative, give those details prominence, show those moments in scene if possible, make them memorable, and give them lots of real estate, give them some space. Scene evolves in present time, giving the reader the sense of being in the experience in the moment. By contrast, summary, where you, for example, state something like 10 years later, is condensed time. The most stretched out use of time is description, which slows down perception, allowing us to see the finest detail, as in this example from Virginia Woolf's short piece of autobiography called Sketch Memory. If life has a base that it stands upon, if it is a bowl that one fills and fills and fills, then my bowl without a doubt stands upon this memory. It is half asleep, half awake, in bed in the nursery at St. Ives. It is hearing the waves breaking, 1, 2, 1, 2, and sending a splash of water over the beach. And then breaking, 1, 2, 1, 2, behind the yellow blind. It is of hearing the blind draw its little its little acorn across the floor as the wind blew the blind out. It is of lying and hearing the splash and seeing this light and feeling it is almost impossible that I should be here. Of feeling the purest ecstasy I can conceive. And here she writes so memorably, I think, about how we feel as a child. That moment that's so powerful. Honoring the reader means honoring your work and yourself. Are you giving your fiction or memoir immediacy and authenticity? Are you creating a connection with the reader so that he or she is invested in your story as you are? In memoir, you're transforming your life by writing this work, excavating the past and weighing how these events have shaped who you are. The reader also must gain understanding, insight, or a new perspective by reading your words. Your story takes the reader on a journey she hasn't gone on before, setting up a situation that demands exploring. It is unusual enough or charismatic enough or thoughtful enough to entice us to keep reading. In that sense, all stories are mysteries, and complex stories are about the mystery of personality. These stories all open a door on the unknown, and we expect the writer to make this excursion worth our while. We expect to learn something, be entertained, think about or feel things we have never experienced before. Most of all, the reader and the writer take this journey together, and both emerge transformed by this experience. Thank you.